Right now in medicine, everything is based upon the assumption that the HIV virus is the cause of AIDS. All the research funding, all the theoretical papers, all the drug development, all have this very same assumption. This entire enterprise is now threatened by a man who comes along and says, wait a second, you're on the wrong track.
Professor Hiram Catton, ethicist. The orthodoxy will collapse because it flunks the practical tests. The AIDS epidemic was a mirage.
This opens up the door to all the lifestyle measures that medicine has so long discounted. The idea that it could be in the behavior of the AIDS victim, it could be in the diet, it could be in the lifestyle in some fashion. This opens the door to an avenue of therapy that medicine cannot accept because it is not based upon their model, it doesn't use their drugs, it doesn't rely upon their expertise. You don't even have to know the physiology of the body to be able to teach someone a principle of good living. And so Duesberg simply opens the door to this vast area of lifestyle and its effect on health. And if lifestyle is the issue, the doctor can no longer be the physiological authority who cures all. That is simply an unacceptable option.
Inner city poverty is a compounding factor when you talk about disease. That's where the IV drug use problem is. That's where the heterosexual spread is going to be. That's where you're going to see the pediatric cases. So that group needs not only to be educated, they need to be helped in ways that totally transcend biomedical research. They need to be treated for their IV drug use. They need to have the healthcare delivery system improved. They need to get taken out of the squalor of poverty that they find themselves in from birth. So you're dealing with sociological problems that compound the public health problem.
My sense of it is that the issues that are not being debated in the AIDS problem are the same issues that are not being debated in general across the board when one looks at the interface between biology and medicine. That is to say that what's not being addressed are those agencies out there, those signals in the environment which are enormously effective in bringing about a disease. Those are not being addressed almost anywhere, but what is being addressed is the rather narrower issue of what infectious agents cause diseases, what kinds of things go wrong genetically with the organism, either with the organism's own genes or having the organism incorporate a viral genome. These sort of magic bullets in reverse are the kinds of things that the medical science establishment focuses on, and they tend not to look at all at those environmental issues. Life habits, the presence of carcinogens, of toxins in the environment, all these things for which it's very, very difficult to earn a Nobel Prize are being disregarded.
There are at least 400 scientists, journalists, and other interested people in that group for the Rethinking the AIDS Hypothesis. But that's 400 people now. They do include amongst those a couple of Nobel laureates. One who's most recent in chemistry, Dr. Curry Mullis, who is the inventor of the PCR test, and he is with us. He does not support the HIV hypothesis. Why scientists are this way? They may be afraid of their grants. I mean, look what's happened to Peter Duesberg. He doesn't have a laboratory anymore. That takes away his credibility as a scientist. He's a laboratory scientist. He's not a theoretical scientist. They're making him a theoretical scientist, but in fact he's a laboratory scientist. He's one of the great geniuses. He's well known for his laboratory technique. And what has he gained from his courageous stand? He doesn't have a laboratory. I think lesser scientists see that and will keep their mouths shut.
Recently we had a major press conference. All of the media were invited. None showed up. Why is the media so resistant to the story that there are people alive and well who had full-blown AIDS and used natural therapies in the recovery process.
You know, that's almost incomprehensible to me. I cannot imagine why that wouldn't be the biggest news story of the decade. But I guess what we have to do is we have to consider them recipients and suckers to, so to speak, a propaganda effort that apparently has worked.
If they only have one microbe to warn you about, if there's one virus equals one disease, and there's one thing that you should do to prevent it, and that is to have safe sex or not share needles, which is the very simplistic propaganda that we are given by the government and by governmental scientists. That's a very easy message for the press to pick up on.
I certainly do believe that the media has a responsibility also. And that responsibility is to report fairly on all of the latest breakthroughs in whatever it may be it health, be it technologies, that the media has that responsibility to take a close look and report on what they have been able to investigate and what they have seen as the truth.
So what has happened is government propaganda has been translated into editorial style, so that there is absolutely no way for a reporter working within that system to question the propaganda, because it has become concretized into the actual editorial style of the newspaper.
Dr. Charles Thomas, molecular biologist, who says, perhaps the most morally destructive fraud perpetrated on young men and women of the Western world.
One of the things that I've noticed over and over again is the hardest thing to get a handle on is the panic. That intense chronic fear.
Dr. Alfred Hassig, immunologist. The sentences of death accompanying the medical diagnosis of AIDS should be abolished.
The things that we're feeding people emotionally about this disease are much more deadly than the disease, than HIV itself. The emotional content of HIV infection is 75% of the battle.
It's down to a money-making situation, and politics, of course. I mean, that's why you have lobbyists out here. I can remember when the situation started, where they were saying, well, you got to cut back on red meat. You shouldn't eat so much red meat. You shouldn't drink a lot of milk. Of course, you have the dairy lobby and you have the meat lobby, and so they're out there against that.
A lot of alternate health professionals talk about choice. In reality, because our information is so controlled and so limited through our education, through our media, that people really don't have realistic choices to make in the first place.
Now, the doctor says, and the government would say, you know, that's not approved by the FDA, so you can't touch it, you see. But I think it's up to that individual to say, if this is going to help me, if anything is going to help me, because the other thing is not helping me, then I should have the right to try that and not have to be afraid of the government.
Physician is the person that should make these treatment decisions. In fact, we have bureaus like the Food and Drug Administration and the National Cancer Institute make these decisions instead. They have taken away discretion of the bedside doctor and instead placed that authority into the hands of a bureaucrat in Bethesda or in Washington, D.C. And doctors usually do a better job because they're there, they know the patient, they're with the patient. And so today, really, the doctor works from a cookbook that is issued out of the federal government, and they have to abide by that cookbook, or they may be found guilty of malpractice. So doctors are practicing defensively, and patients are running scared.
We are really upset about the fact that 11 years have gone by since this epidemic has been identified, and in spite of the fact that out in the field, in small clinics all over the country and indeed around the world, people are finding methods of survival, of improving quality of life, extending the length of life, stopping opportunistic infections, and they're doing it using a variety of approaches, many of which are non-toxic, minimally toxic, that use natural medicine, and that use some strategically placed conventional drugs. But all of those approaches, because they tend not to be the high-profit drugs, they're not getting federal research, and of course they're not getting private pharmaceutical money being put into them, and therefore we don't have this knowledge being systematized and spread out to the general public through the medical community.
What are you trying to gain by this demonstration today?
Just to get it more into the public that the general use of supplements is in great danger from the proposals that the FDA is putting out, that their facts are based on scare tactics and not based in the clinical facts. And we need to make this thoroughly known to the public, because most people don't realize what the proposed regulations could entail.
Why are we relying on the federal government to do something about this war? And why is it in their hands? That's a good question. I think that it's probably there, again, because of tradition, because people have just turned their lives over to someone else. People just don't want responsibility.
People can develop resistance against AIDS. Now, every time that's the case, there can be no epidemic. If there's no epidemic, then there's no need for the massive enterprise built up around the AIDS epidemic.
I don't understand how medicine discounts so many things like acupuncture and vitamins. I thought they were people in a helping profession who were looking at every way to help people, but they're not. They're only looking at if their way works, and it's all about money.
I think it is just a matter of time before the media begins to acknowledge that certain alternative therapies, or what are currently being called alternative therapies, actually are achieving a fair amount of success.
There seems to be a double standard as far as the doctors are concerned. They'll use many of these drugs that haven't been proven on human beings, and they use them on AIDS patients. But these very same doctors will not use herbs, and they will not use vitamins, and they will not use minerals, because, I don't know, could I say that the bottom line could be the profit motive?
I am suspect about everything involved in this AIDS epidemic, because it seems only, if HIV causes anything, boy, if it causes anything, it certainly causes fundraisers, and it raises funds in many different ways. It sells stocks, it supports dances, it has all sorts of, sells condoms, and keeps the AIDS establishment going. I mean, the doctors are treated very well by the pharmaceutical companies. They're wined and dined at the meetings. The meetings are incredible trade shows. People playing with condoms, pulling them over their heads, blowing condoms up, seeing how much air they could hold. All of this stuff goes on. And there wasn't even a lounge for people with AIDS. There were, at some of the conferences that I've gone to, they put a lounge for people with AIDS at the farthest building from the conference, on the 4th floor, without a couch, without even any water in the room. And they had to be reminded, the conference governors had to be reminded that perhaps you could put some water and some fruit, maybe, and maybe a couch. And their ACTUP had to carry the couch into the room, and then they put guards at the door.
The money and the prestige build error upon error into a mountain of misinformation that creates viral diseases where, in fact, we should be looking elsewhere for the cause.
I would say that disaster, AIDS has taught us that disaster is a career opportunity, and it's used that way. I mean, it's something to make yourself famous over, something to get prizes for, something to get some public recognition, or something that will make you some money.
The technology for AIDS is amazing that they have introduced here. And now biotechnology, they are going to bring in gene therapy. There's going to be a conference in Florence in April on biotechnology and AIDS. This is money. It's not profitable to cure AIDS. It's simply not profitable.
There's a whole empire has been built on AIDS. I mean, there's people that need this now. For corporations, pharmaceutical companies, they have a lot of money invested in our plight, in my plight. I'm angry about that.
The truth becomes lost in the glitter of one side and the apparent mundaneness of the other side. Truth is simple. Truth is ordinary. Thomas Jefferson said he could not believe any matter of the conduct of our life could be a matter of science, because he says for every man of science there are thousands who are not. What would become of them? Here are the thousands who are not. And I agree with Thomas Jefferson. The truth about the conduct of life is simple, is ordinary. It is about you and I, ordinary people, living our lives in good and helpful ways. But that lacks glamour, it lacks newsworthiness. Its only virtue is that it happens to be true.
There's every reason to think that AZT will kill you faster from an AIDS-related disease than if you were taking AZT, because it's a DNA chain terminator. It will kill every cell in your body that's making DNA.
I have looked at many dozens of studies used to claim benefits for AZT, and there's not a single one of them that I would regard as being scientifically credible. Now, there are lots of studies of maybe a few people which are merely observed by somebody without a control. These are more or less in the level of anecdotes. But of the studies used to claim benefits for AZT, all of them, without exception, were financed by Burroughs Wellcome, the manufacturer of AZT, and were controlled by them. And I would say, therefore, they are open to question simply on this basis alone. The few studies over which Burroughs Wellcome had no control, one of them being a study conducted in Paris by Durnon and colleagues, found no benefits for AZT. And the Concord study, which took place between Britain and France, giving AZT to people who were asymptomatic, also found that there were no benefits to AZT. And perhaps not coincidentally, Wellcome did not control this particular study.
Over the years, I mean, I've been quite hostile to the use of AZT. I remain so with respect to AZT being prescribed the way it was recommended. I think that was, all I can say, it was a sort of horrendous decision, and one that has resulted in the mess, partly contributed to the terrible mess we are in as far as treatments are concerned.
We see the proof like the phase 2 AZT trial, garbage. AZT should have never been unleashed. We see examples like the Concord study or the Veterans Administration study that say that these approved medicines only benefit the pharmaceutical companies and their stockholders. There's certainly no benefit to people with AIDS.
The phase 2 trials were the basis of the drugs being approved by the FDA for marketing in the United States, and also the basis for the drug being approved in 31 other countries. There were all sorts of irregularities. Actual cheating took place in at least one of the centers. And on top of that, the investigators, the people working for the FDA, used data which they knew were bad. And yet this study is still being used to claim that AZT extends life.
They tested AZT, it failed, but what they said was, now wait a second, we know it works because the logic is correct. We've proven the logic. We simply have to work harder, do more experiments, but we will not give up the logic. So medicine's proof is the excellence of its explanations. The fact that it fails in tests is considered irrelevant because we know the explanations are correct.
The original research for AZT said that it killed infected cells at a rate 1,000 times greater than healthy cells. But there are now 4 papers after that original one, which is also a Gallo-Bolognese paper, this one, that shows that, in fact, AZT is quite democratic. It kills all cells equally at the same rate. And, in fact, that means it kills healthy cells at a rate 1,000 times greater than they said it did.
Rudolf Nureyev was healthy before he started taking AZT. He was HIV positive. He was in a state of extreme anxiety, and he got tested, and he was positive. But at the time, he was in great physical condition. It took something like about 2 years before the AZT finally killed him. They attributed it to a type of heart condition which allegedly was caused by an opportunistic infection. But in my opinion, Rudolf Nureyev died of AZT poisoning.
So you feel Brian White's death was due to AZT?
Absolutely. He was taking AZT and had hemophilia, a combination of the two. We helped him die.
When people first take AZT, their white cells do seem to fight back as a natural reaction to AZT, and we will see the T cells, which is the kind of white cell selectively affected by the AIDS virus, we will see the T cells start to rise, but then in about 4 to 6 months they go right back down again. One of the criteria for AZT failure is T cells 50 points lower than they were before someone took AZT, or a T cell count of 50. I think that's being very generous, actually. We do see T cells march right down to 0, and I do mean 0, while people are faithfully taking AZT. This is a drug that is clearly exerting a toxic effect and not doing anything at that point.
By virtue of determining to substitute for the immune system by attacking this alien agent with a drug, medicine has literally replaced the body's immune system. What can it do but become weak? Medicine's model allows no other logic, however, and as a consequence, since the victim is helpless, the destruction of the immune system is irrelevant. He was helpless to begin with. He's helpless when it's over, but medicine has stepped in with a substitute to save the day.
Many of the current drugs on the market, primarily AZT, tends to, I'd say about 30% of people I've seen, severely weaken their immunity, and therefore makes their body have to work harder to have immune strength or power, and therefore the body uses up their basic nutrients in the process, and really their body is fighting against the AZT. It's a detriment.
Several years ago, there was a campaign to get everybody who might be at risk for AIDS to be tested for HIV antibodies. And then if they found that they were positive according to these extremely unreliable tests, they were told that they should go for what was called early intervention, early medical intervention. And there were slogans put out, put time on your side. The early intervention meant purely and simply AZT. And rather than putting time on the side of these people, what the drug did and is doing is to terminate their lives.
I think people are out there with AZT in a desperation move, basically, to use a drug to produce some sort of a short-term benefit, but the cost is a further encroachment on the individual's immune system. So it makes no sense except as a sort of a psychological, almost a psychoanalytic, sociological analysis. It makes no sense scientifically.
How do you know which is the disease and which is the effect of the drug? I don't know, and I would challenge a doctor to tell me.
Some of the most vocal critics of the HIV equals AIDS hypothesis are a group of Australian researchers led by Dr. Eleni Papadopoulos Eliopoulos. In their breakthrough report, the scientists raised serious questions about the accuracy of HIV antibody tests, and more importantly, the very relationship of HIV to AIDS. In fact, in their newest work, they are questioning, has HIV even been isolated?
As far as we're concerned, if one goes through all the HIV literature which exists to date, I think one will find it bold and incredible to still believe that there is proof for the existence of HIV. When a particle looks like a retrovirus, you have to isolate it, then put it in another culture, show that the cells in the secondary culture produce particles exactly like the particles from which they originated. That the two particles from the two cultures are exactly the same can be shown only by determining their constituent proteins and RNA. So isolation is extremely important to prove that a particle is a retrovirus.
From the mid-70s until 1984, when the so-called official cause of AIDS was found, it was shown that many individuals within the gay community were suffering from a unique form of gay men's disease. The original theory was that AIDS was caused by a lifestyle.
It was in June '81 when the first publication came out, published by the Centers of Disease Control, saying 5 men had PCP and 2 of them died, even being treated with Septrim, this last or the strongest antibioticum available.
AIDS was first identified among gay men in 1981 who practiced certain lifestyle behaviors. They, according to the New York Times, on July 3rd, 1981, tended to have upwards of 2,000 sexual contacts a year and used a lot of aphrodisiacal drugs, including poppers, amyl nitrite, a very dangerous substance that gay men had been inhaling in epidemic proportions since the early 1970s. And with regard to the sexual activity, you don't need to be moralistic to say that, you know, gosh, you have 2,000 sex partners a year, you develop a laundry list of infectious diseases, venereal diseases, that can do a lot of damage over the long term to your immune system. Doctors and scientists looking at this phenomenon early on said, gosh, they do a lot of drugs, they have a laundry list of venereal diseases. The combination of these factors might well be enough to knock their immune systems for a real loop.
They took tons of antibiotics to treat the perpetual infections they would get by having a lot of different sex partners. And between the drugs and the infections and the antibiotics and the treatments, plus just partying all the time and being very run down, it's really a wonder that they didn't get sick sooner.
One of the leading critics of the war on AIDS is Professor Stefan Lanka, a German biologist and virologist who questions the isolation of HIV and many contradictions and lack of proper scientific reasoning behind the HIV theory, including the wrong form of treatment for a person with AIDS.
The background of AIDS, and we are absolutely sure about this, is the antibiotic resistance catastrophe, killing people in hospitals like flies, because there are no antibiotics available without resistance in some bacteria. So in a state of immune suppression in the hospital, a lot of people come down with bacterial infections. This is called sepsis because of blood poisoning. When too much bacteria are growing and producing toxins, this is going to kill them in a state of reduced immunity. And we had these problems already in the beginning of the 70s. There have been kind of emergency conferences dealing with the problem because they were scared that resistance would spread and they have no antibiotica available. So they invented a very strong antibioticum, and it's not an antibioticum to say it's pure chemotherapy. It's a double folic acid antagonist. The good old sulfonamide and 2 of them put together would kill every microbe. But the problem is they were scared that in the gay scene new resistance would develop and spread into the population.
I mean, before 1984, when it was announced that HIV was the cause of AIDS, or the probable cause of AIDS, it was sort of more of a level playing field in a sense, because viral causation hadn't been proved, and scientists and clinicians were looking at more of a multifactorial model, maybe an environmental model, or even a toxicological model to explain the phenomena of AIDS.
Many of the early AIDS cases were very, very sick. They were close to death when they got their diagnosis. Some of them had Kaposi sarcoma, which is a poorly understood affliction of the blood vessels. At the time, they thought it was a cancer. Now it's known it's not. But they were given aggressive forms of chemotherapy, which had the result of killing virtually all of them. The doctors later realized it was a mistake only to the extent they stopped it, although the medical profession never quite admits they've made a mistake.
The AIDS definition was there before, saying if you have PCP and if you have KS caused by nitrites as well, because the nitrites are transformed into NO only in the smallest vessels, because the partial pressure of oxygen is high enough to perform this transformation, and NO is a very potent growth stimulant. So we have this neoplasia and hyperplasia in the endothelia, and this condition is called a Kaposi sarcoma.
It was on April 23, 1984 that Margaret Heckler announced to the world that the cause of AIDS had been found, namely HIV. Dr. Robert Gallow's colleagues said that his research made possible a blood test for AIDS and that a vaccine would be ready for testing in 2 or 3 years. That was in 1984.
AIDS started partly when they said that it's possible to measure the strength of the immune system, analyzing or counting T4 cells, the so to say helper cells. But that's not possible. And it has already been published in '81 in the journal JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, saying that it makes no sense to count subsets even of lymphocytes because there was never a correlation. It could be high or low and people are healthy or ill, it doesn't matter. So this was already known. But the problem was at this time already that in medicine people would not look to the facts but what is possible to sell on the market, because it was the year 1977 when it became possible to patent medical techniques. So they wouldn't care if there's any a clinical meaning behind those measurements, but they just sold it on the market. And the model of immunology would say at this time, if the immune system is weak, so cancer would appear. And that has been fundamentally mistaken, and it was wrong when they said it in '81. They knew it already in 1980 that this has been wrong. The immune surveillance theory of cancer came into existence when the war against cancer failed.
About 1970, major cancer research laboratories were passionately involved in attempts to demonstrate that retroviruses were associated with human cancer. They really didn't get very far, not far at all. And somehow, around 1980-81, when the first cases of AIDS were reported, this came to these groups as at least one way out of the mostly negative results they had obtained for about 10 years before. So the AIDS research, I regard it as an extension of an earlier effort to demonstrate retrovirus in human cancer.
They were working with the test, with cells in the test tube and say, look, we have a high activity of reverse transcription, therefore a virus must be inside, and the virus is the cause of cancer. But the nature of cancer is much different, and when they found reverse transcription everywhere, they gave up the idea that retroviruses would cause cancer. And they were not speaking about it anymore, but wasted billions of dollars into this and developed chemotherapy based on this idea that the multiplication of genetic material, and they were thinking of the viruses, should be blocked. So they developed molecules which were incorporated in a growing chain of newly to build up genetic material, and which would kill the build-up or prevent the build-up of this genetic molecule, and the cell eventually has to die. The idea of retroviruses in cancer is long over, but the chemotherapy still is there because it's sold, and they have no idea why, no rational explanation why they are using chemotherapy.
In 1984, Robert Gallo comes along, gives a press conference and says, hey, all of these diseases are caused by a virus. Here's his theory. HIV kills T cells, decimates the T cell population, causing acquired immune deficiency, which opens the gateway to infection with any number of opportunistic infections, 30 at this point. This is what we call the syndrome of AIDS-defining diseases. Problem is, if all these diseases among these populations were caused by a virus, one would think that these, this constellation of diseases, this syndrome, would spread from the original risk populations into the general population. That's what infectious diseases do. They spread out of the original risk populations. Problem is, through 1992, this simply wasn't the case. After 10 years of this so-called raging AIDS epidemic, over 90% of AIDS patients cumulatively remain within those original risk groups. And of those remaining 10%, you have to consider that those included all homosexuals who didn't care to admit their sexuality to their doctor, all IV drug users who didn't care to admit their drug habits to their doctor, and all infants AIDS patients. So you've got a disease that's really restricted to certain risk populations, and it's not spreading. Hence, it's terribly unlikely that this disease could be caused by a virus.
In science, certain rules must be followed for any agent to be considered a causative factor in disease. The first rule is that an agent that is going to be blamed for a disease should be able to be isolated from each and every case of the disease. That is not true in HIV and AIDS.
In my judgment, and to the best of my reviewing of the current literature on that subject, I've never seen a clear demonstration, of a direct isolation of HIV from patients. I've seen some evidence of virus particles observed occasionally in very complex culture systems. But this, to me, is no evidence for direct isolation from the patients.
It's been isolated by thousands of laboratories throughout the world. It's probably the best studied virus of any viral pathogen in the history of human diseases. So to say that it doesn't exist and it hasn't been isolated is beyond preposterous.
What AIDS researchers call virus isolation, or HIV isolation in this case, consists of two things. They will get their tissue culture where this HIV is supposed to be growing, and they'll check it for reverse transcriptase, which is an enzyme that was supposed to be specific or only exclusively found in retroviruses. And if they find reverse transcriptase in the tissue culture, they say, aha, we have now isolated HIV. Another thing they'll do is they'll check the tissue culture for a P24 antigen, which is one of the proteins that supposedly belongs to HIV. Both of these things, reverse transcriptase and the P24 protein, are about as nonspecific as you can get. In fact, reverse transcriptase can be found in any number of different places. Normal cells contain reverse transcriptase, and under certain conditions, they will reverse transcribe RNA into DNA. The hepatitis B virus also contains reverse transcriptase. And most importantly of all, the cells of people with leukemia have also been shown to have reverse transcriptase activity. And why this is important is that every HIV culture, starting with Robert Gallo, were co-cultured with leukemia tissue. You couldn't just take the blood from somebody with AIDS and culture it in the tissue culture all by itself, because nothing would grow. They couldn't find any HIV that way. So they had to co-culture it with cancer cells or tissue from people with leukemia.
We know what is reverse transcription. That's the repair of mechanism of the ends of the chromosomes. Yeah? And therefore we have high activity in cancer cells or Montagnier embryonic cells. But Montagnier never said that he found the virus of AIDS. He said this could be probably an effect and to be carefully studied.
Now, of all the years and the decades that have gone by where people have studied retroviruses, researchers have concluded that they all share certain common characteristics. First of all, they have a certain density which causes them to band at the 1.16 grams per milliliter density gradient. Their morphological characteristics have to fulfill certain requirements. First of all, they have to be round. They can have a diameter of between 100 and 120 nanometers, no more, no less. They have to have dense cores, and they have to have spikes or knobs on the surface. Well, in terms of AIDS, we didn't even find any retroviruses there in the density gradient. In fact, 80% of the material that ends up there is cellular material, just garbage really from the cells of the tissue culture. And the remaining 20% may or may not be a retrovirus. Just because it ends up there doesn't mean you've proved it's a retrovirus.
If you take any material of cellular origin and put it on the sucrose gradient, you also will get a band at the density of 1.16, but you better make sure you don't declare that this band is pure virus unless you do a careful control of what's in that band by electron microscopy. And I believe that for some reason that control, which is essential in retroviral research, has been neglected for about 15 years, and that has had disastrous effects.
If you want, you can spend a fortune and take electron microscopic pictures, which we did at the beginning, and which other labs did at the beginning, in which there are hundreds of them. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. There's, I would say by now, thousands of pictures of HIV. We have drawers full, stacks full, this high of electron micrographs. Okay, pictures of the virus. So, but banded once you picture,
banded material 1.16.
No, you can look at banded material. It's obvious retrovirus. Do you know what a retrovirus looks like?
I have a picture showing what a density gradient of pure virus should look like. I mean, the way that you determine if something is pure is to stare at one object, take in its appearance, and then look at every other object around it and make sure that they're the same. And you can see that mostly this is pure particles. There are some where these are arrowed which are slightly different, and this is not unusual. However, in March 1997 in Virology, and published by Glushenkov from France, the first pictures of purified virus were revealed to the world. You can see from this that this material is anything but pure. In fact, the authors of this paper concede that this so-called pure virus is predominantly cellular material.
The particles that were found in these two 1997 studies did not fit the characteristics of retroviruses. They had no knobs on them, and they were the wrong size. In fact, the volumes of the particles in these studies were either anywhere from 50% greater to 750% greater than the volume that a normal retrovirus particle really ought to be.
Now, it seems hard to believe, but this material that retrovirologists, including Montagnier and Gallo, were isolating from their cultures, labeling pure HIV, and producing by the thousands of gallons in order to make proteins for the HIV antibody test and for other research purposes, was never examined under an electron microscope in order to determine that this material contained pure retroviral particles. Now, I say it was never examined under a microscope. I assume that some scientists must have examined it under an electron microscope, but no photographs of this examination were ever published in the scientific literature. You know, one can only guess why they weren't.
If you take a culture which has never had a retrovirus added to it, and you put it on the bench and wait for a week or two, it may actually start to produce retroviral particles and the other phenomena which go with retroviruses spontaneously. You can increase the rate of appearance of this and the yield many times, millions of times, by irradiating the cultures or by adding the same stimulating agents that are used in AIDS cultures, or by culturing with other cells, co-cultures, as are used to isolate HIV, or just fluids from other cell cultures. And these viruses are called endogenous retroviruses because they come from within and not from without. And the reason that they appear is because we inherit DNA which can actually be made to go to work to actually produce these phenomena, these particles. This is actually called endogenous retroviral expression. I mean, we're looking at 1% of the human genome as being made up of endogenous retroviral information, instructions sitting there waiting to make retroviruses when switched on by some stimulus. And so we don't know if HIV is a genuine retrovirus, that it may in fact be endogenous, and it may be the result of getting AIDS and not the cause. I mean, this will not be the first time that this has happened. Retrovirologists themselves in the past have in fact postulated that diseases may cause retroviruses and not the other way around.
Retroviral-like particles are practically ubiquitous everywhere in cell cultures. You simply can't point to one in an impure cell culture and call it HIV. Even Robert Gallo admits that particles that look like retroviruses but aren't retroviruses because they can't reproduce are found not only in impure cell cultures, but even in the band associated, the density band associated with purified HIV particles. You need more evidence than that before you can point to one of these particles in a cell culture and say it's HIV. Unfortunately, these particles are reproduced by the thousands in newspapers and magazines. They're the basis of artist conceptions that you see in Newsweek and Time. None of them have been proven by standard means that we have at our disposal to be not simply retroviruses, but a unique retrovirus, HIV.
Little wonder the public is confused about the subject of HIV testing. For on the one hand, we're told to take the AIDS test. The AIDS test is to determine, will we get AIDS? Do we have the HIV virus? Which will then mean we will eventually have AIDS and die. But all one has to do is open the test kit, look at the literature inside the test kit, and clearly it says that this should not be used as interpreting a person has AIDS or HIV virus. Well, therefore, if the test is not testing for the presence of a disease state or even an antibody that could precipitate a disease state, then what is its value?
There are two tests in common use. One's called the ELISA, the other's called the Western blot. The only difference between them is that in the ELISA test, all the so-called HIV proteins, about 10 of them, are all mixed up together in a solution. And in the Western blot, prior to reacting, the proteins have been separated out into a nitrocellulose strip. Now, the test that really matters in all this is the Western blot. So we really don't need to discuss the ELISA test. It's used as a screening test, and it is admitted by experts that it is not sufficiently specific to diagnose HIV infection, whereas the Western blot, if positive, is considered synonymous with HIV infection.
The standard screening test is an ELISA. Occasionally you get a false positive. Under those circumstances, a Western blot can absolutely confirm. Western blots are also important when you have people, for example, who have been vaccinated in vaccine trials and making antibody against one protein. The only way you're going to tell if they're infected serologically is by looking at a Western blot showing they make antibodies to the other protein. So it has a lot of value. It's fundamentally a confirmatory diagnostic test.
This is representing a Western blot strip. A Western blot strip is a thin strip, like the strip that your doctor uses to test your urine. And in it, on the strip, placed several proteins, 10 of them in the case of HIV, separated by their molecular weights. And in the test, plasma is added to the strip, and if there are antibodies in the plasma which react with any of these proteins, then the strip turns dark. So a Western blot test appears as a series of dark horizontal bands. Now, one of the problems of the Western blot test is that it is not reproducible. This is a test of a positive serum performed in 19 reference laboratories, all on the same specimen of blood. And as you can see, just by looking at this, no two are alike.
The proteins used on that Western blot strip that scientists claim are HIV proteins may not necessarily be HIV proteins. There's no proof that they are, and there's plenty of evidence that these are normal human cellular proteins that have been misidentified. This conclusion seems hardly debatable in the case of P32, one of these purportedly HIV proteins that's been shown to be identical in amino acid sequence to a normal human protein associated with human T cell function. Another one of these proteins, P41, has been considered by Montagnier's group, Montagnier, the original discoverer of HIV, to be a contaminant, the ubiquitous cellular protein actin. Yet it's right there on your Western blot test, masquerading as an HIV protein.
It's nearly impossible to determine the rate of false positives because there is no gold standard to independently verify test results. People with non-AIDS diseases have antibodies that can register a positive result on the HIV antibody test. Indeed, people with multiple sclerosis, T-cell lymphoma, generalized warts, and other diseases have the P24 antigen.
And picking up the torch as the campaign chairman of the American Foundation for AIDS Research.
Use red, nobody's dead.
We'll have red products, we'll have red phones.
Last year we raised over $1 million, we were very happy, and now it's grown immeasurably over the last year.
Members of the public often notice the celebrities who have suddenly and inexplicably become experts on public health. We have turned these kinds of stars into authorities on things way beyond their own training and their own knowledge.
Science, with its harsh efforts at total objectivity, can actually hold within its ways of operating the seeds of its own failure.
At least they should open up the field to people with other theories, because their own has proven to be such a resounding failure.
In science, we cannot have any prejudice. The fact that AIDS started in the gay community has nothing to do with the sexual preferences that this group of people have.
Why do they not acknowledge the virtual immunity of women in the United States and Europe and developed countries?
I think that we've been basically chasing the wrong paradigm for the last 20 years, and I'm afraid to say that it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon.
They'll backtrack a little bit, but they'll never give HIV up.
We should continue as combatively as we can to speak out and shake up the dogma at all levels.
The next generation of younger doctors is going to now be able to see all the information before them.
If you really sit down and look at HIV research and all the findings that have been presented over the years, you still find no demonstrable qualitative or quantitative activity. Those are scientific words that basically mean we can't find either enough of the type of the virus or enough of it to explain what we then see with the decline of the immune system. There is no real relationship, if you really get down to brass tacks and look at the fine details, which I and others have done, between the amount of HIV in a person's system and whether they get sick or not, or how fast they get sick.
HIV has never been isolated directly from one single AIDS patient. Some pictures, some electron microscope pictures were taken in cell cultures, highly contaminated with a variety of other cells just to make sure that some retroviruses would be found in them. But this was never demonstrated as originating from a single AIDS patient.
There is this notion that HIV jumped from a chimpanzee to a human sometime in the 40s or 50s in Africa. The problem is they've never been able to isolate that previous strain in the chimpanzee. Where is the pre-human version of HIV? It ain't there. They cannot find any animal carrier or any animal reservoir for HIV in the wild. It seems to have been in humans quite some time. And as a matter of fact, Jonas Salk, a very famous scientist who developed the polio vaccine, told me and others in 1994-95, before he passed away, that he probably thinks that HIV was 900 years old in humans, and other researchers have basically postulated even longer.
California microbiologist Dr. Kary Mullis was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993 for his development of one of the most widely used current techniques in molecular biology today, the PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. This revolutionary technique allows scientists to take a sample containing a very minute amount of DNA and replicate that DNA sequence until there are many copies. One of the first applications of PCR was to analyze human tissue for the presence of HIV. PCR is commonly used in medical and biological research labs for the detection of virus culture in infectious persons.
The people that are AIDS researchers now are getting neurotic if you ask them any questions. There was a time when I first started asking questions, all I wanted was, where are the papers? Just tell me the papers that you read that convinced you that HIV was the cause of AIDS, because I need to reference those papers in some of the, I was working on a test for HIV with PCR, and I needed to write a little report to the NIH and say, here's the progress we've made. And the first line of it was, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I thought that was true. This is before I got involved. And I said, what's the reference for that quote? And I looked for it for about 2 or 3 years, and I never could find it. And by the end of 2 years, I'd ask everybody at every meeting that I'd gone to that talked about AIDS, I'd ask, you know, I'd look through every computer database. There is no reference. There is nobody who should get credit for that statement. And that's a pretty weird situation in science, where getting credit for a discovery is the most important thing in your life as a scientist.
It's not just Peter Duesberg or some outsiders who criticize the failure of our war against AIDS. It's the orthodoxy itself. They advertise they have not saved one single life. That means, in conventional scientific logic, there could very well be something profoundly wrong with the basic hypothesis, with the basic approach that we use against AIDS.
It wasn't a plot, it wasn't even greed or anything like that. It was a mistake in certain circumstances that happened, but the failure has been that science failed to correct that error. Subsequently, it's had plenty of opportunity to do that, but the whole kind of bandwagon that got rolling.
This year, an estimated 40,000 individuals in the United States and almost 6 million people worldwide will become infected with HIV.
With all the feeling associated with it, the compassion for AIDS patients, the fear of what was happening as this purported virus was thought to be spreading sexually in the world's populations. That feeling, that emotion, stopped science from following its normal checks and balances and putting right this fundamental mistake.
After 20 years of research, with nothing on the vaccine horizon, pretty inconsistent treatments, and no actual mechanism by which we are to understand this tiny little piece of genetic material causes the complete collapse of the immune system, I think it's high time that we started looking at other alternatives. Not to say that HIV has nothing to do with AIDS, but there probably is something going on, and some of the biggest minds in AIDS science are beginning to suspect this as well. I think public health advice that you give to people in the midst of an epidemic has to be grounded in the science. And the science did indicate, and still does, that AIDS as we understand it is definitely something that sexual activity is one of the big risks for.
T cells are a type of white blood cell called lymphocytes, and they play a central role in the body's ability to fight off all kinds of germs and diseases. Now, based upon the theory that HIV piggybacks onto T cells and renders them useless in fighting off infections, T cell counts became increasingly important as an indicator of how far along the disease had progressed. Starting in 1993, in addition to an HIV antibody test, a T cell count below 200 would now be used to diagnose someone as having AIDS.
According to the CDC's own statistics, 65% of patients who've been diagnosed with AIDS in the calendar year of 1997 were diagnosed solely on the basis of having a positive HIV test and low T cell counts.
Certainly, T4 decrease cannot be considered the hallmark of AIDS because it appears in many patients who never develop AIDS. In fact, all you have to do to have a decreased T4 cell is to go on the beach and lie there for a few hours. And if you measure your T4 cells, more than likely they will be very low.
It's not possible to measure the strength of your immune system using the blood. It makes no sense because only 2% of those white blood cells or lymphocytes said to be responsible for immune functions are in the blood. All the others are in the tissues where they have to do their work.
The health infrastructure throughout a whole country.
Security agenda is protecting lives.
Many Americans may not realize.
We've got 25 years of unlimited money being spent on AIDS, and yet there is absolutely nothing serious to show for it.
It's too dangerous for the government to fund basic research, because with government funds comes politics, and politics only permits one view to prevail, rather than competing views.
All this money spent, this $billions of dollars, is not preventing AIDS, not curing AIDS, but making the problem bigger.
Science nowadays, it's no science anymore. It's more about public relation, power, business, industry.
The whole thing might have been based on bogus science.
Why are we spending so much money today on AIDS research? In fact, more than we spend on either cancer or heart disease. Where has all this money gone? And to what benefit? What are the results? What groups of people have found relief? Certainly not those who need it when they enter into research programs seeking some form of improvement or a cure. Is that the reason so many in the gay community are very vocal and organized, gathering at conventions, at open city areas, demanding a release, a cure after all these years?
They're going down a particular path which is leading them nowhere because they're not solving the problems. And all the time the public are saying, where is the magic cure? We've spent millions in this direction. What's happening?
The money in Africa is riding on a large number of people being diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. All of the organizations in Africa that have money are associated with AIDS.
If someone came along and told him there is no AIDS, all there is the same diseases that Africans have been dying of all along, then all of a sudden millions of dollars of funding would dry up.
In 1988, Dr. Philip Kreinen and his wife trained in tropical medicines before moving to Africa to help AIDS orphans. They were told that this was an epicenter of AIDS in Africa, where more than 50% of people had HIV and AIDS. But upon arrival, they did preliminary testing and found that only 13% of the population tested positive, not 50%. Shortly thereafter, they did more definitive testing and found that the number fell below 5%.
It is the first time in Africa that a village has volunteered as a whole to be tested for a dreadful disease, that everybody has got its results, and that the truth has been 5 times lower than the figures given by the World Health Organization of the AIDS control program.
When a person had tested HIV positive, he would give them support, nutritional supports, help with housing, help with drugs for the illnesses that they actually suffered, like it might be TB or intestinal infections. He would give them direct help for what might otherwise have been called AIDS. But he would give them the medicines appropriate to their actual diseases, and he would give them nutritional support. And he found that these people, after a period of support like this, had lower death rates. This is the people who've tested positive and who his charity was set up to help.
Because of AIDS, with the diseases which are called AIDS here, which are similar to the symptoms of AIDS, they are less and less since now 2 years.
He ended up by saying, you know, Neville, after 5 years we've concluded that there's no AIDS and no AIDS orphans. And since that time, he's had a policy that his charity and the regions that it serves have completely renounced the HIV/AIDS story altogether. They just have nothing more to do with it because they think it does such harm.
How can you ask people who believe they're going to die tomorrow, how can you ask them to look into the future, which are the children? They give up. They don't invest. They don't want to come to work in Northern Kagera because they think they're going to die of AIDS or to contract it.
The World Health Organization claims that 10 million HIV-positive Africans are responsible for 300,000 cases of AIDS reported since 1981. Unlike in developed countries, where over 90% of the AIDS cases are promiscuous homosexual males, intravenous drug users, and blood transfusion recipients, African AIDS is supposedly suffered by men and women in equal numbers, who contract it presumably through heterosexual intercourse. The African figures are often cited by the AIDS establishment and safe-sex activists in Europe and the United States to prove that everybody is at equal risk.
This has become a calling. This has become a kind of endeavor fighting AIDS, in which people who believe in what they're doing cannot, in good conscience, hold a contrary thought. It's what psychologists call the mentality of taboo. Holding a critical thought, if you are in the AIDS orthodoxy, is against the rules. It's a taboo because it means, or it suggests to mean, that you are turning your back on the people that you are supposed to be helping. The cure for AIDS in Africa is as near at hand as an alternative hypothesis as to what is making Africans sick in the first place. And that is what I strongly recommend people do before giving any more money to these AIDS organizations.
If you ask me, are people sicker today than they were 30 years ago? I would answer you based upon my knowledge of what is taking place in Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Senegal, South Africa, the massive civil wars that have occurred, the starvation, the enormous refugee camps, the malaria and tuberculosis that goes virtually untreated. Yes, there is no doubt in my mind that people are sicker in Africa and living shorter lifespans. When people get an AIDS diagnosis based upon clinical testing, they return to their villages to die. They basically give up all hope. They lose their will to live. They become outcast. They're rejected by their extended family, forced to live in a secluded, segregated little hut where they are given only meager amounts of food and water and prepare themselves for death.
What people don't realize about Africa is that life expectancy there has never been particularly long. To think that the arrival, shall we say, of HIV or AIDS in Africa has suddenly started shortening life expectancy in African countries is really contradicted by the evidence.
The media reports that 1,000 people a day die of AIDS in South Africa. It is a number with no statistical grounding, no evidentiary basis whatsoever. It is simply something repeated in the media. But if one goes and checks that number against the actual official statistics of South Africa, what you will discover is in 2004, in South Africa, a country of 46 million people, the total number of deaths that were attributable to HIV diseases was about 13,000. That's about 36 a day.
There has been a lot of death and disease and AIDS in Africa for many centuries. And again, our clinical tools and Western medicine penetrating some of these more remote corners of the world has allowed us to define a phenomenon that may well have been there for a very, very long time.
There was a study in the Journal of Infectious Diseases in 1994, for example, that made it quite clear that when they did these HIV tests on a population in Zaire, where there was widespread tuberculosis and leprosy, that the test results in 70% of the cases were false positive. If the test results are 2 or 3% false positive, a test is basically invalid. It's useless in terms of epidemiology. Usually these tests are conducted at a sexually transmitted disease clinic. Maybe 100 or 200 people are tested, or they're done at an antenatal clinic where pregnant women are also tested. And from those samples, then projections are made about the rate of HIV/AIDS.
The infrastructure, social and medical, is non-existent. Post-colonially, over all these 20 to 30 years now, 40, the services have disappeared. Malaria control, TB control. In areas like the Rakai in Uganda, there is no water that's clean. The pathogenic assault, the toxic assault of filthy water, malaria 11 times before you're 7 years old, diarrhea 7 times before you're 1 year old, makes your immune system very, very at risk and depressed. And if you test people with a severely challenged immune system, it is likely, according to the work of Professor Hessig and Eleni Eliopoulos now in Perth, that you will show antibodies that come up from the stress. And these antibodies are being called specific to HIV and are being called infected by HIV. I don't believe that. I believe they are autoantibodies that are developed as a result of your body's immune stress.
One of the reasons that HIV is thought to be new in Africa is we have blood samples from the 60s that show no evidence of HIV. But the one question that journalists haven't answered is where that blood came from. And if you look carefully, it did not come from the same risk groups that we are now drawing blood from today and finding lots of HIV. It came from British school children in Uganda in a sort of the colonial time when Dutch and French and Brits were colonizing Africa.
If we're really honest, we would go back and we would do much more retrospective analysis, even go back 100 years, to find embalmed tissue, embalmed organs, and test them for HIV, and I think we'd be very surprised by what we would find. I believe we would find that both HIV and the group of infections known as AIDS are old phenomena found all over the world. Based upon my 25 years of research and massive interviewing, more than 3,000 physicians, scientists, experts, and activists on the subject of AIDS and AIDS-related illnesses, particularly how it was affecting Africans, there appears to be only one startling conclusion that I can reasonably come to, and that is, AIDS is not about a virus. No, it is about the untreated underlying diseases such as malaria, tuberculosis, malnutrition, and waterborne illnesses including diarrhea and parasitic infections. It is about living in dire poverty and conditions of chronic civil war. It is about suffering the lethal effects of the AIDS diagnosis itself, including the harmful drugs that are prescribed. In clinic after clinic where AIDS individuals are provided, however, with good nutrition and clean water and proper medications for underlying illnesses such as malaria, the vast majority of individuals return to proper health. But when AIDS individuals are severely compromised in their immune systems and are given the most lethal medications ever created, they do get sicker and they die. But their deaths and illnesses are then blamed on the HIV virus instead of the real illnesses underlying their AIDS conditions. More and more experts are agreeing on this view of AIDS, and yet this view has been suppressed as contrary to the financial interest of the AIDS establishment and its drug manufacturers. Isn't it time that we take a closer, unbiased look at AIDS in Africa and its real causes and real solutions?
If the HIV test is so accurate, why is it that 1/4 of the population of southern Japan has tested positive for the HIV virus, but only 14 have gone on to develop AIDS?
In 1991, that was the first that I heard that a different way of looking at the causes of AIDS had been put forward by Professor Peter Duesberg. I had missed this story. He had published on this in 1987. I didn't know anything about that paper until 1991. And when I first heard that there was a different way of looking at it, I was concerned. It was like a threat to a lot of the reporting that I'd done, and I didn't like to feel that I was going to have to change tack on something that I'd invested so much time and energy and so much reporting from that point of view. So when I was told that there was this different perspective, I was resistant to it. And I hoped that I'd be able to dismiss it. And I had a bit of space in early 1992 where I was able to read in more detail the literature, the challenge that Duesberg and one or two others had made to the conventional view, and to see what had been said in response. And to my surprise, I found that there'd been an enormous amount of abuse with which his arguments had been greeted, either ignored or abusive response, but that actually nobody really grappled with the points that he was making. And that made me feel that perhaps there was something here that was worth putting before the public.
He thought that HIV could not possibly cause AIDS because retroviruses were never known to kill cells. It's only when AIDS came along that all of a sudden they started saying that a retrovirus, HIV, was killing cells.
Professor Kary Mullis is one of the most unique minds in America. He won the Nobel Prize. Well, Dr. Mullis believes, well, I'm not going to tell you what he believes. You can hear for himself. He's a very unusual person. We did this interview late at night at his home on the ocean.
The people that are AIDS researchers now are getting neurotic if you ask them any questions. There was a time when I first started asking questions, all I wanted was, where are the papers? Just tell me the papers that you read that convinced you that HIV was the cause of AIDS, because I need to reference those papers in some of the, I was working on a test for HIV with PCR, and I needed to write a little report to the NIH and say, here's the progress we've made. And the first line of it was, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I thought that was true. This is before I got involved. And I said, what's the reference for that quote? And I looked for it for about 2 or 3 years, and I never could find it. And by the end of 2 years, I'd ask everybody at every meeting that I'd gone to that talked about AIDS, I'd ask, you know, I'd look through every computer database. There is no reference. There is nobody who should get credit for that statement. Now, that's a pretty weird situation in science, where getting credit for a discovery is the most important thing in your life as a scientist.
This agent just hasn't passed the very first tests for a pathogenic agent. And of course, this was what Peter Duesberg pointed out in his 1987 paper, his first to demonstrate and draw together the evidence that demonstrated very, very clearly that if HIV existed, it could not be found at all easily, even in the bodies of AIDS patients, let alone those who tested HIV positive. He pointed out that with most infectious illnesses, you have billions of virus particles present in small quantities of blood and elsewhere in the body of a person, especially those with active disease. But that even in AIDS, HIV couldn't be isolated directly from the bodies of these patients. What you had to do was take samples from the patients, kickstart them with stimulants for the immune cells, mix them with cells from other people, and eventually you could get something out. But it wasn't isolatable in any conventional sense. And it really should have been basic science that told people that the HIV theory was deeply flawed.
I feel that there is no scientific evidence to prove that HIV is either the primary or any of the causes of AIDS, because no appropriate tests have been done. Now, HIV is a virus that is present in a lot of AIDS patients, but that does not make it the primary cause.
You could predict, and I did predict, that the outbreak of AIDS in Britain, and even in New York City, which was one of the original epicenters of AIDS when it started, even there, AIDS would follow a predictable course of increase among men, especially in high-risk groups. It is still mainly 90% a disease of men in high-risk groups.
I think the cause of AIDS is different in different risk groups. For gay men, for example, we have to have one thing very clear: only a very small group of gay men are affected by AIDS. If you play with the statistics, you come down with less than 3% of the American male homosexual population is affected by HIV, not even AIDS. And that's less than gay men dying every year of heart disease, you know, drug-related issues. But in a certain minority group amongst gay men, and certainly as far as we could trace it down, the early AIDS cases qualified as such, certain behavior could clearly cause the two diseases that were initially the AIDS-defined diseases, PCP and KS.
It's extraordinarily difficult to become infected with HIV. You have to have a very special receptor on your cells. This was only recently, and the New York Times put this out last week, that some work was done where they found that you need another protein called fusin so that HIV could actually infect the cell. So the fact is, unless there is something that people can take to make them susceptible to HIV that could mimic this fusin so that HIV can infect cells, the cells are not so easily infected.
Is this the most studied virus ever?
Absolutely. 60,000 papers have been published on it just earlier last year. 60,000. That's 6 papers for every little nucleotide that's in that virus. That is orders of magnitude more than on polio, on measles, on mumps, on all viruses combined.
And yet we still cannot prove that it explodes and is massive to the population.
Or that it causes AIDS, for that matter.
The HIV antibody test is a very bad test. I believe that it is one of the worst frauds committed on the American public in the century. Well, just about everybody believes that if you get one of these tests, it will actually tell you whether or not you are infected with HIV, and if it's positive, that that's some kind of a prediction of whether or not you'll get AIDS. And that is absolutely not true. First of all, a positive result on that test doesn't mean that you're infected with HIV, and there is no way that it can mean that. There's a basic scientific principle that most people are totally ignoring, and right now I'm talking about the scientists and the doctors who are advocating these tests. The people that say these tests are 100% accurate. I would say more that they're 0% accurate. And the reason for that is this test contains what you call antigens. They are proteins from the HIV, the virus. And the principle of it is that the HIV proteins in the test kit are supposed to react with any kind of HIV antibodies that may be present in the person's blood sample. So the HIV antigens would react with the HIV antibodies. And theoretically, only HIV antibodies react with HIV antigens. Now, in reality, what really happens with antigens and antibodies is that they're not exclusive with each other. They're more promiscuous. In other words, antibodies will react with antigens that they don't belong to. In other words, let's say I have tuberculosis, and I have antibodies to the tuberculosis organism in my body, and I go out and take an HIV antibody test. What might happen is that my tuberculosis antibodies will cross-react with the antigens to HIV in the test kit, thereby giving a false positive. And these kind of cross-reactions are very, very common and very, very predictable as far as HIV antibody tests go.
We get a lot of cross-reacting. For instance, if you've recently had a flu jab, you're told not to have an antibody test because you might come up positive. 41% of patients with multiple sclerosis in one study tested positive for HIV. 12% of people with generalized warts. If you live in an area where tuberculosis or leprosy or malaria are endemic, you could come up positive for HIV even though you don't have HIV. So there's so many different variables as to what might give a positive reading. I don't believe that any test has ever yet given absolutely specific HIV antibody results or reactions.
You could test positive because normal body proteins like actin and mycosin react with the test. You can test positive for all sorts of strange reasons, and that will go on your medical records, and your doctor will look very sorrowfully at you and said, "You have just tested positive for the AIDS virus. You are going to die."
Now, it's a deadly thing to tell somebody when they have a head full of 10 years of the imagery of AIDS that they are now HIV positive and in a risk group for developing AIDS, in the risk group for developing AIDS, because HIV positivity is built into the definition of AIDS.
And HIV positive means antibody positive. It doesn't mean that you've got the virus. On the contrary, it means exactly the reverse, and hence you should be protected and not predisposed towards getting the disease.
That's the whole purpose of vaccination, to give you an immune response to the virus in the form of antibodies that would be measured on an antibody test. So it's really ridiculous to say to people that because you test positive on these tests that you're going to get AIDS and you're going to die prematurely. It just doesn't make sense.
The problem with the Western blot, and there are many, is not only that it is susceptible to the same flaws that cause cross-reactions on the ELISA, but that is not reproducible and it's not standardized it is possible to test positive or negative on the same Western blot done on the same blood specimen, depending on what test kit you use, whether it's from a different manufacturer, what day of the week you go in, what lab you go to, or even what country you live in.
Now, the Western blot is considered the more specific of the two tests because it uses 10 proteins to detect antibodies, whereas the ELISAs conventionally use 2 or 3. Western blot uses 10. You can get a positive Western blot in Africa that would not be considered positive in Australia. You can get a positive, by official, this is official guidelines, you can get a positive Western blot in Britain that is far more specific than a positive Western blot for the largest gay men's study, HIV and AIDS, the MAX study in America. In the MAX study in America, on the Western blot, which American viewers will know is essential to HIV-positive diagnosis, you required only one strong antibody band out of a possible 10 in order to be called positive. In Britain, that is insufficient. So we're in a situation where even on the most specific test, it matters what country you got tested in. So is this absurd?
I have a chart here that will show you that one of the best ways to change from positive to negative is simply to change your residence to a different country. This was published in Continuum magazine from London. It was made up by Val Turner, a scientist in Australia who has done a lot of work on HIV antibody tests. And he has pointed out that there are different criteria for reading these tests. And each one of these columns shows the different criteria from different countries or places. Now, as you can see, going from one column to the next, there are different criteria. Without looking real closely, you can see it's pretty obvious. In Africa, all you need is 2 of these bands to be positive. In Australia, you need 4. In the United States, we have 5 different sets of criteria for reading Western blots, and they are all totally different. So if you go to a lab that uses the American Red Cross criteria, you may be positive. And if you go to a lab that uses the FDA criteria, you may be negative. And if you go to a lab that uses the CDC criteria, you will more likely be positive there because they use much more lax criteria. Now, this is totally ridiculous. How can you say that somebody is infected with HIV or not, depending on whether they live in the United States or in Australia? It's totally absurd.
What are the different antigens and antibodies and conditions will cause a false positive reading?
Well, like I said, we have hepatitis B, and we have herpes simplex, which is a very common condition. There must be millions of people in the United States infected with that. And flu, or a flu vaccination will do it, and even the common cold. Now, this would be a very rare chance that that would happen, but it is a possibility. And in countries like Africa, where it's supposed to be riddled with AIDS, or in Southeast Asia or India, where we are supposed to have these new up-and-coming heterosexual AIDS epidemics, what's really happening there is that there are such huge amounts of endemic tuberculosis and malaria and hepatitis B, and all of those things cross-react on the tests, that's what's happening. When people are tested in those regions, it is very easy for a cross-reaction to take place. And there are other things, such as alcoholic hepatitis, the connective tissue disorders such as lupus or mixed connective tissue disorder, or rheumatoid arthritis, and there are a lot of people that have that. And the methods of the viral load papers and studies, the methods are wrong. They're shoddy science. They don't make sense. They're based on PCR, which isn't really good for HIV, and they just don't do the right calculations. Plus, even if they did actually find millions of viruses like they claim to have found, what they're claiming to have found is not the latent viruses that have infected the cell, but free virus, which is outside the cell. Now, the old standard mainstream AIDS research says that free virus, which is outside the cell, is not infectious because when it is outside the cell, the envelope of the virus is very fragile and it usually will fall off. So in order for one cell to infect another with its HIV, the cells have got to butt up against each other. And if the virus is just free and it's out floating around in the bloodstream, it's probably lost its envelope. And the envelope is a crucial part of the infectivity process. Without the envelope, it can't infect because it can't bind on to the little site, the receptor site, where it's supposed to bind itself.
The general public doesn't understand the idea of a gold standard here. Neither do doctors, physicians. So, I mean, you know, you just pull the average physician away from his convention someplace in Cincinnati or something and sit down and have dinner with him and talk to him about this kind of a situation and see how much he really knows. Like, does he know what a Western does? Does he know what a Western blot actually does? I mean, how is it different from this ELISA test? Does he understand how an ELISA test is operated? Does he understand anything about the statistics associated with the times when they've been tried? No, he doesn't. And he doesn't give a damn either. What he knows about is that when he has a patient, he charges them a certain amount of money for every treatment that he does, for every little prescription that he writes, and he likes to have a lot of patients. And the county health department also knows that due to the Ryan White Act, for every single person who is diagnosed as having AIDS in the county, $2,500 a year from the federal government. So the county health department is actually pressuring doctors by their little subtle ways. They're not coming over and beating them, but don't miss an AIDS case. You report it to us. If it's a positive test on the HIV, you report it to us because it's $2,500 in our pocket every year.
I'm suggesting specifically, Professor Stewart, is that if JAMA, Nature, the British Medical Journal, the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, the 5 major medical publications in the world, will not allow dissident views on the cause or treatment of AIDS or any information around it, how then are you going to encourage a dialogue that could challenge the orthodox?
Good question. You've mentioned the big 5. You've mentioned Science, Nature, the New England Journal, the Lancet, and the British Medical Journal. Now, with the possible exception of the Lancet, all of these have refused to publish views which doubt the existing hypothesis about AIDS. And the 2 main aspects of the hypothesis are that AIDS is caused exclusively and finally by HIV, and secondly, that this is universally infectious and will cause a pandemic by heterosexual transmission in the general population. Those are the 2 prime tenets of the existing hypothesis, which is held by the consensus. Now, the Lancet has published some stuff, mainly by me, in the form of letters, which cast doubt on those 2 essential pillars of the hypothesis. They haven't published much else, and the other journals have published nothing at all. They've been asked to do so again and again by myself and others, but they will not publish.
Reporters came, asked these questions, and found them, my views or my hypotheses, very logical and convincing. But they never aired them because they were censored at the highest level, presumably when an executive producer would have called the National Institute of Health, is it all right to show this view, advanced by Duisberg from Berkeley, that AIDS is not infectious. And he probably was told from the by the National Institute of Health, this is impossible, you can't show that because people will stop practicing safe sex or will stop taking their AZT. That will endanger our anti-AIDS prevention programs and treatment programs. So that would be a disaster. Don't show Duisberg, and that's what they do. They follow orders like everybody else.
How much censorship has there been in the gay press concerning looking at all issues and all arguments from all sides, fairly and objectively?
The censorship in the gay press is a tragedy, a disgrace. It's been almost complete. There are people in this city who work quite hard to try and create the space in which a proper discussion can be had.
As I continued to work the issue as a journalist, I gradually became more and more skeptical. At the same time, I was also involved in AIDS activism and could see how the organizations changed over the years. I've been involved in Being Alive San Diego. I've been involved in ACT UP San Diego, and now I'm a co-founder of HEAL. It always seemed to me that this would be an issue that activists who are concerned about finding a solution to AIDS would grab onto. They would be interested, as I attempted to share my growing doubts about the HIV/AIDS model, and instead I saw people clinging to HIV with an almost religious fervor.
The consensus controls the thinking, the funds, the grants, the publicity, and the policy.
The media has just gone along with the government party line, and it's partly their fault and it's partly the government's, because I know that any journalist who dares speak against what the government says is cut off, and the government won't give them the story or the information they need to write. So I blame both the government and the media.
Do you feel scientists have also allowed themselves to be co-opted because if they challenged, they wouldn't get any funding?
Yes, scientists who speak up against the HIV theory are cut off almost immediately. This happened to Peter Duesberg. He has no funding when he used to be able to get any grant he wanted. And one kind of hears through the back door of various scientists who agree with him, and they come to him in private and say, "Don't say my name, but I agree with you, and I can never say that because I know I'll lose my grant if I do."
My funding, for example, from the National Institute of Health will not be renewed as of this year, and I may be out of business then. Also, my colleagues have essentially excommunicated me. I'm not invited to meetings, or hardly ever to meetings anymore, not ever to one on AIDS. I'm not allowed to publish in the same journals anymore as I used to. Even as a member of the National Academy, I cannot publish in the National Academy my views that drugs may be the cause of AIDS. And I have plenty of evidence to support it, to document my claim, which might be very relevant to the health of millions of Americans and people on this planet. Yet I'm censored because I'm essentially considered to be an outcast or an odd man or somebody who has controversial views.
One can only imagine the horror of getting a test result that says that you're now HIV positive. For most, they would equate that with AIDS and a death sentence, but not everyone. For many, the HIV positive test has taken them on a unique journey, a hero's journey, overcoming obstacles, as you will see, with a very unique perspective.
In 1988, I was first diagnosed with the HIV virus, and by 1989, August, I collapsed at work. I'll never forget that day, taken to the hospital, etc., to find out that my immune system was on a downward slide. By 1990, I had a cough that had gotten bad enough that I was coughing up blood, had KS lesion on my thigh, in my mouth, down my throat, hairy leukoplakia, etc. And the doctors were telling me, based upon that, especially from the cough, that I would be dead probably within a year.
In February of 1990, I was diagnosed as being HIV positive in Hackensack, in a clinic in Hackensack. The clinician was very cold about telling me this. I really didn't hear what the implications were. I just thought I was going to die.
The doctor called me, he says, I have bad news, and I says, I thought my lover was infected. And they said, no, you are. So that was kind of a shock. I was always tired. I didn't know what was going on. I have Epstein-Barr virus, and I have hepatitis A, B, and C, and every other thing.
There's so many stages to this, you know. The onset of diagnosis is depression, there's anger, there's hatred, fear, why me, how could this happen to me? And what happens is, you know, your disease becomes bigger than you are. And then you're in trouble because you start watching AIDS movies and reading AIDS books, and your negative friends don't want to deal with you anymore because it's now consumed your life, AIDS.
Found out about a year ago that I was HIV positive. And it was one of the most devastating, unreal experiences that I'd ever had, and because I also at that same time turned 50. And somehow it just didn't seem to go with my life or me and who I was, and I had to bring back into focus everything about who I was and what I was going through in terms of not only my age, but my health, and all those factors seemed to combine.
I know a minister in Texas who's continually being harassed just for running a home where people have AIDS. And people with HIV, they go to a church picnic in Ohio, are told, don't bring any food to the picnic unless it's cellophane wrapped, and we want to make sure the cellophane is on it when you show up. And so the hostility that exists in our culture towards people with this virus is for many of us in these urban areas, we're quite protected, but out in the nation at large, it's a very difficult situation.
The fact is that there are those of us that now can't get life insurance, can't get mortgage insurance, are being discriminated against because of the fact that we were diagnosed as having a disease and we could live now for 50, 60, 70 more years, but because of the fact that maybe we went out on disability or whatever, we were diagnosed as having that disease, we cannot do anything about it. I can't get a mortgage because of it.
I'm colonized with Pseudomonas, and I've had this for about 15 years, way before the HIV. And that's the only problem that I've had, other than, you know, I keep getting infections because I'm colonized. And just recently, when the CDC expanded the definition of AIDS, now I have AIDS. You know, you know, and meanwhile, I've been dealing with this for like 15 years.
I'm a retired chef. I lost my job because of my disease. I don't even want to say disease, because of my illness. My lover didn't want me anymore. I lived very, very well. I lost my job, my lover. I had to move. I moved twice in 6 months.
I found a woman and spent some time with her, and she tested positive after me, and we split up because of that, and I lived on West Harlem. So here I am. I went from president of my own corporation in New Jersey to a bike messenger living on 136th Street with rats and with a broken leg, well, broken kneecap, and living on $400 of disability because as a bike messenger I was an independent contractor and I had no means of employment. So I started digging in the garbage for 5-cent nickel deposit cans out of the garbage and to refund them to supplement my income. Being totally healthy the whole time, despite I had a broken leg, and I thought I was going to die.
What I tell people is as painful as it is, I think you have to be honest. I don't think that you can hide your situation from anyone. Not only is there a legal requirement to tell people what's going on, I think personally you get better when you start telling the truth. I don't see how someone can have a major recovery when they're secretive about what's going on and they're hiding this stuff. I know the risk is isolation and rejection and horrible things, but anyone who really cares about you will stand by you. And the people who walk away, who the hell needs them? You're better off without them. That's my opinion.
I
was referred to a doctor who advised me to go on AZT immediately because if he could keep me alive for 3 years, he almost was guaranteeing me that there would be a vaccine. I did go on the medication. I had no side effects. I handled it well, but I just was something in my body was telling me not to take it. Don't take it. And it wasn't political. It wasn't anything that I read. It was just a feeling that I had, and I did discontinue taking the medication, and my T cells remain up there in around this 1500 range.
Upon my first diagnosis, I was given a prescription of 1,200 milligrams a day of AZT, which now, by the way, we realize causes horrendous things in the body. And that was it. So I did the nucleoside run, did everything they told me to do. Everything made me very, very ill. Now, when I first got to the doctor, I really wasn't that sick. Then I started getting sick, and I said, well, this cannot be right. My body does not want this.
When I first was diagnosed, the doctors were like, well, I want to put you on AZT. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to live my life. I don't want to die. And I feel like I've made the right decision.
I was surrounded by 3 rubber-gloved, white-coated clinicians at Bergen Pines Hospital in Bergen County, New Jersey, and was told that early intervention was of extreme importance, that not doing anything was folly. Well, after protesting about 3 times in a row, I bolted out of there and prepared to die.
When I started taking it, I broke out with herpes inside my mouth, inside my nose, all over my lips, and it was like all I wanted to do was sleep. I didn't want to get out of bed. I had pains. I knew going through the detox of drugs my body well enough to know that AZT after several weeks was horrible for me.
I am taking AZT, and I'm taking acyclovir. I don't like it, and that's what brings me here, to come back to the fundamentals of taking care of my body and my mind together.
It wasn't until 89 or so when this real shaky research I felt came through saying that if your T4 cells have gone below 500, you should be on AZT, and the implication was that people who chose not to do that were being irresponsible.
Everything they'd given me didn't work, and they gave me a new name. They labeled me nucleoside sensitive. So there's a genre of us that are nucleoside sensitive. So what do you do now? You know, I can't take their drugs. My body didn't want their drugs, you see, but that was fortunate that I really took that as a good sign. And I knew, and this was my advice to just everyone, take control of your treatment. Educate yourself about your body. It's your body. They don't know how you're feeling. They don't know what's going on. All of the medication in the West, you know, it dissolves you in one part of your body. It may help you in another.
I started getting sick around 1985 after I was exposed to defoliant C while in service. I got 2 tests done. Both were inconclusive. Then I came down in a series of about 12 different opportunistic infections. Thrush and candidiasis, and what they thought was KS, and 3 bouts of PCP pneumonia. And those who tell you can't survive PCP pneumonia, full of crap, because you can. Just can't take cortisone when they offer it to you, or pentamidine. And I was lucky enough to be in ACT UP when ACT UP still had some muster and anger to it back in 85 and 86, and started taking a look at what was going on at the NIH and the CDC, and flipped out and was scared out of my mind because there's nothing coming down the pipeline from them.
The people who follow the advice of the so-called experts, the doctors, the AIDS expert, they get sick and die. It's almost 100%. And yet wherever you find pockets of long-term survivors and people who are at risk in staying healthy, they've taken charge of their health.
None of us anticipated the AIDS epidemic. By 1984, all of the friends that I knew and loved had died. And I was still around.
From the experience of my friends who've died having used AZT or any of the other pharmaceuticals that doctors love to prescribe for AIDS, I've also read a lot of information about AZT. I understand it's very toxic. I would never take it. God willing, I will never take AZT.
I would say that approximately 70 to 75% of my friends are no longer around. 4 years ago, I had perhaps one close friend. I've always been very gregarious, and I always had a good support of friends. And for 3 years, up to 4 years ago, I was stripped out of all my friends because they all died. So all in all, I've known probably like about 15 people. So that's a lot of people for one person to know to have died of this illness.
I felt when I first was diagnosed that this was a signal for me that I really had to change my life and that I didn't have a choice anymore.
I made a decision that I could look at this as being a victim or look at it as another one of life's adventures, and I decided to look at it as an adventure.
When I was diagnosed, my first reaction was nausea, and then the next reaction, I can honestly say that was a feeling that I am not going to die. I am not going to let myself die. You know, if there's anything at all that I can do to contribute to, you know, to my being healthy in my future, then I was going to try and find out what it was and do it.
The first change I made was I faced death, you know, more than once with drug overdoses and such, but I decided that I really wanted to live, and in doing that, I decided to do anything and everything that was possible to make sure that my life would be full and that I would enjoy the moment because it was too precious.
How do you help them find people who may have not tuned into their own inner voice, their own power, their own spirit, face this challenge? And I don't think there's any question that marshaling the forces of the immune system, marshaling the will to live, promotes health. People might just challenge it, but I personally can't. There's just too much evidence of people just getting a grip, commanding their lives, and living longer, and making something of this, the challenges presented by AIDS.
I decided in 1991, January, I will never forget it, I changed my doctor that insisted on me taking AZT because that's what they told them. And I changed that, and I changed a lot of things, and I took my own power back.
I started doing a lot of reading as far as reading my own blood work, so I knew what questions to ask my doctors. Many of my doctors got frustrated with me. They would, you know, tell me they're the authority, that they know that not to get caught up in this, but I always wanted to know. And I fired quite a few doctors.
Came to heal, and thank God for Mike, because I started calming down. And I started realizing that getting arrested every week or so with ACT UP wasn't working, and that if I stopped being so panicked, I could start taking control of this.
Clearly, over and over again, people come to our meetings and say something very similar to what he said. I'm feeling better than ever. AIDS was the best thing that ever happened to me. When I heard that the first time, it gave me a headache. I couldn't understand how someone can say that. But then you hear it over and over again, and you carefully understand what's being said. What's being said is that people were empowered. They took charge of their lives. The whole way of living, it's more than simply their health, but their whole relationship to their life has changed. And it's one where they're ready, willing, and able, and reliant on themselves to do whatever they need to do. We want to help people help themselves. And we have found over and over again the people who get better are the people who do it themselves, No one can do it for them.
The food is really our main teaching tool because people come down to the center, they sit at our family-style tables, they get a lot of support from the people around them, they're able to share healing resources, information about new treatments, interesting stuff that comes up. But the food is the main teaching tool. They see it, they're able to experience it, then they want to know more about it. And that's where we're able to follow up with our classes in cooking, our lectures.
And the name Whole Foods Project pretty much says it all. We serve organic, vegetarian food, and whole foods simply means food that is as close to its natural state as possible. So we don't use canned foods, we don't use highly processed foods, we don't use any dairy or meat. So we are a vegan program.
Just coming here lifts my spirit. I've been very depressed and isolating. There's so many groups that I come to here for meditating, body work. I mean, without the Manhattan Center for Living, I don't know what I'll do. I mean, it's just a place to come to for refuge.
I get a lot of feedback here. Someone said, what you all really serve is love on a plate. And I go away feeling lifted. And that is part of what we do. It's not measurable, but it certainly makes a difference when you start caring about something and you want to know where your food came from. You want to know that it wasn't grown with chemicals. And there's another element of this. These chemicals are not only hurting us, but they're hurting the farm workers that are using it. And so we have to sort of start broadening our view and seeing what is the real effect of the standard American diet. And so when we take it home, we care for it, we cook it, we serve it with love, we're really taking care of ourselves, and that may be more important, actually, than what we're eating.
I really don't put a lot of energy into worrying. I live my life. I have a good time. I'm active in a lot of organizations. I'm on the board of directors of God's Love We Deliver. I do a lot of service work, a lot of volunteer work, and that's really is what my life is about. I also teach, and I also enjoy doing that.
It's given me a new life, a new outlook, a freedom. I mean, I get goosebumps when I think about it, because I'm happy. I mean, I'm happy to work with people that are worse off than I am. And believe me, we can all stop and think a moment.
Is there any hope with AIDS, or is it just sit back and let the people die when they die? I have to say that, you know, the research is, Michael Callan interviewed more, he himself is a long-term AIDS survivor, more long-term survivors than anyone else, said that if there's a characteristic that these people have in common, long-term AIDS survivors, it's grit. So these people didn't just think that life was worth living, but life was worth celebrating.
It's been a real wonderful experience for me, not having AIDS, but just as far as my life. I'm an ex-addict. I have been clean for 6 years, and just by changing my life, by exercising, by juicing, by taking vitamins, by just being positive, has turned my life around tremendously. I feel wonderful. I feel great.
Because of these changes, I have not had a single opportunistic infection since I've been diagnosed. And I don't know how many years before that I was carrying the virus, but I've been very healthy. People tell me all the time how good I look, and I never hide my status from anyone. I'm in the public. I'm a business entrepreneur. I'm an antique dealer, and anyone I discuss this with, they're always interested in my input on what I've done to myself, because they tell me I always look good, and I continue, and I firmly believe in the practice of preventive medicine.
I just have no time to have AIDS. And as far as labeling, you know, the labeling of AIDS, one by one I've been peeling them off and peeling them off. And it's the very insistence that I'm ill, and I refuse to be ill, and I don't look ill.
Every day I get up and I sort of start over, and part of what I tell myself is just keep an open mind. You know, you don't know what's going to happen today. It could be anything. And I try to bring that attitude to my work and to my healing as well. because the world is full of miracles, and they could happen at any moment.
Yeah, life is an extraordinary gift. This is a part of a journey for me. And I feel like I'm walking on water. We all are. My doctor said to me, whatever you're doing, he said, keep doing it. So that was a shock to me because I thought he was in charge. Well, I'm in charge. And so wish me luck.